Hello, Tennessee Voices viewers and listeners. This is David Plazas, the Opinion and Engagement Director for the USA Today Network Tennessee and the Tennessean. Today, I have the pleasure of having as my guest Jackie Sims, who is the Executive Director of the People's Alliance for Transit, Housing, and Employment, also known as PATH. Jackie, how are you doing today?
Very well, David. Very well. Thank you.
For people who are not familiar with PATH, could you talk a little about the work that you have done and why you formed in the first place?
Okay, certainly. I got involved with PATH in 2015 as a volunteer. I was a volunteer for a couple of years. And what piqued my interest about PATH was its intention around working with people who generally are not heard from, don't have seats at any tables. Their voices are generally quite silent. But these are the persons that PATH was seeking out to pull into positions of leadership and to speak on behalf of similar persons in a general population. Sometimes we call or refer to this population as the least of these, but they're persons whose voices are important but rarely heard from. So that really got me excited. All my work has always been grassroots, but too often the people that we are attempting to serve, the impacted people, their voices are silent. They're rarely brought into the conversation. So I found this very refreshing.
This has been really interesting because during these last several years, we have seen this tremendous interest in Nashville as a destination area and as a place for people to relocate. Meanwhile, a lot of people who have been here for a long time have not been able to keep up with the cost of living. I've seen also, footage and also photos, many photos of some of the PATH demonstrations, from, the coffins related to affordable housing to really holding officials to the fire, their feet to the fire on a variety of issues. Would you tell me a little bit about the context of what is it do you think citizens need to know about the top issues for those citizens that you serve?
Okay, the top issues for the citizens I serve are housing, employment, and transit, and how they intersect and where and how they impact persons' lives. And we're generally talking about lower wage working people in the city. And we're also generally talking about the persons who provide the most service to the city to make Nashville, Nashville, the essential workers. These are the persons that we spend our time and efforts serving and focusing on in Nashville.
One of the things that I have often seen, and I myself have been critical of it as an editorial writer, is the push by politicians to say that Nashville is a progressive city. I got a little bit in trouble for saying that Nashville is not, just from my own observations and research. Could you tell me a little about what would it mean for Nashville to be a progressive city?
I struggle with that too, David. I find that a lot of persons, first of all, who identify themselves as progressive are very disconnected from the population of people that I serve. Rarely do they engage with this population and interact with this population at any level. But they are so often the persons whose voices that we hear. They're so often the persons who are making the policies, making the decisions that directly impact the persons that I serve on a daily basis. And I question sometimes the motive, whether they are genuinely interested in the people that they're always referring to, talking about, or is it more of their political agendas?
Certainly, we have seen the issue of housing and transit and education being part of the political language.
Yes.
Mayor Cooper recently had his annual State of Metro talking about more investments and, for what would be equitable for communities that you serve right now in terms of what the city is doing well and where the city needs to improve.
Well, I know the city has quite a bit of land. I talk to developers a great deal, and what I hear from them is the cost of dirt is the primary barrier that prevents them from doing more affordable housing. There is some truth to that. And I know that the city owns a lot of dirt. So if the city wants to stop kicking that can down the road from administration to administration, rather than talking about the housing crisis that we all know exists, I think they should be making plans to develop some of the dirt that they own and utilize that for more affordable workforce housing. And when I say affordable, I'm not just talking about below 120% AMI or even at 80. I'm talking about the many, many, many people that I see every day who are below 60%, at 60% or below the average median income. Those people are equally as important as other persons in the city of Nashville. They are residents and they deserve better than what we're doing for them.
And again, these are things such as working poor individuals and people who are working class. One of the interesting things is that as we're recording this conversation this week, it's May 6th today. This week there's been a delegation, as there is usually annually by the National Chamber of Commerce, to San Diego to look at the issue of affordable housing, because a lot of the housing that was initially meant for low-income populations is now being used by middle class and working class populations because of the cost of housing.
Yes.
And so, we're not quite at a level of California when it comes to taxes and housing costs, but it's all relative, I suppose.
Yes, it is. Yeah, because the cost of housing in San Diego is astronomical. Maybe that's why we're getting so many people moving this way from California to our city. We have to really get serious about this whole issue of housing. I spent the entire summer in and out of housing court. I learned a lot about the number of persons who are coming into eviction court and what is driving that. I know there were a lot of issues centered around the pandemic, which was unfortunate, but we have to find a way to seriously focus on ways to address the precarious situation around housing that so many people find themselves in. I meet so many people who are serially displaced. They've been displaced 2, 3, 4 times, trying to figure out how to negotiate an affordable space to live in Nashville with their family. There are far too many people living in cars, living in hotels. This is not good for the city across the board.
Thank you very much. And just to shift to one other subject, you were also involved in the Community Oversight Now coalition that helped push for the referendum that passed back in 2018.
Yes.
In terms of, obviously I think it was 60% of voters approved that referendum. So it was a very comfortable margin of victory.
Yes, it was.
What are the positives and what are the things left to do for the Community Oversight Board since it was passed?
We need the city to stay engaged. I'm talking about General John and Jane Doe resident. Stay engaged, pay attention to the meetings that are held regularly, to remain focused on how the police department is operating in the city of Nashville. Are you seeing improvements? Are you seeing pretty much, the same things that took place prior to the implementation of the Oversight Board? It's important that we pay attention to what's happening in our city. We didn't just do all that work to secure that much needed oversight board for us to not pay attention to the good work that's being done by that board. So, whenever you have time, when they have the meetings, I know they're held at 4, and I think well, I would just look on the Metro site to find. I don't want to misquote the day and time. I do know that they're held at 4 o'clock, the meetings. But yeah, pay attention, residents of Nashville, at the work that the Oversight Board is doing. Use your voices when it's time for a new board to be selected. Get involved in something that should be creating a very positive impact for how law enforcement is practiced in the city of Nashville.
Thank you for that. And we'll be putting a link in this podcast episode to the Community Oversight Board so people can find out more about the meetings. One of the things I wanted to shift to, since we're about midway into the conversation, I always like to ask guests if they would talk about the things that they've been doing to stay healthy and well during this time of pandemic. So what are you reading, watching, doing just to stay healthy and well?
I don't watch very much television anymore. I was an avid watcher of the nightly news, MSNBC, CNN, all the usuals. I've kind of lost interest in a lot of that. I've turned a lot of my attention to my front yard, where I'm doing some gardening. I've been doing some redecorating in my home. Most of my time, unfortunately, well, it's not unfortunately, maybe not enough balance is confined to work. I have been reading a few books. I've almost finished Color of Law, Cast by Isabel Wilkerson. Trying to see what else have I been reading. Most of it is work related. I have been trying to build a deeper spiritual relationship. I find that to be very critical with the work that I do, because it can keep one overly frustrated and sometimes angry, which is not good for one's health. So I have to find different ways to find more balance with the intense work that I do, which for me averages, a good week for me is a 50-hour week. And that's a bit excessive, but it's the nature of, the work that I do.
Thank you for sharing that. And I'd love to learn more about your origin story. How is it that you got into this kind of advocacy, and where does this passion come from?
When I moved to Nashville, I knew that I wanted to be of service. I was a practicing mental health professional in the state of South Carolina, but I did not want to work as a therapist here, and I was seeking out what service might look like when I moved here 14 years ago. And early on, I met Dr. James Lawson, and I had the privilege of training under him for over a year. And that literally reshaped my entire life. I knew an organizer in some capacity would be the work that I would be doing. And I continue to do that. And I still consider the work that I do a calling, especially the housing work. I had some experiences in South Carolina that I draw from now as I relate to people when they're negotiating housing instability.
I'm glad you mentioned that. Dr. Lawson, for the audience members who may not be familiar, is the revered figure. He was the mentor to John Lewis, and was reviled during his time, though, there for the desegregation of lunch counters, and even kicked out of Vanderbilt University, which is named the center after him now.
Yes, he was here in town.
Yeah, could you talk a little bit about what lessons has he taught you to help you with your battle for resilience, especially in the face of some things that may not be so popular, that may irk public officials?
Yes. Dr. Lawson expanded my understanding of violence. We generally tend to think of a physical act where you hit assault someone, do bodily damage. Position, to persons that we should be considering our neighbors. Dr. Lawson helped me to expand who is my neighbor. He helped me to see my work from a deeply spiritual perspective. I think I grew as a Christian because I developed a deeper understanding of what that should look like. But the most important thing for me, and I have to check myself quite often because I think I said, this work can frustrate you and even push you to anger oftentimes. And there is righteous anger, but I have to check my attitudes toward persons who I sometimes see doing harm to the persons that I spend so much time serving, especially around housing justice. And centered, that's a phrase we use quite often. So I find myself being intentional about centering. I speak to my staff about the importance of centering and being mindful of the attitudes that we carry as we do the very difficult work that we do in trying to serve our communities. And sometimes the persons that should be allies in this work and community, David, we find ourselves in adversarial positions with. And that can be deeply hurtful because we often know some of these people and have worked alongside of these people, but there is a level of competitiveness and a self-centering that has crept into community organizing, which is rather distressing. Because when one's focus is on self and what you deem is important to you, then you take your eyes off of the very persons that you are supposed to be serving. A lot of our work that we do is selfless. So, but I'm not seeing as much as I saw in community organizing with selfless work now. It's a different culture. And so Dr. Lawson's teaching me what nonviolence looks like in a very broad perspective has been very helpful in keeping me grounded and keeping me focused on the reason why I do what I do. And it sounds trite, but love really has to be at the center of this work that we do.
Sure, it's so powerful, Jackie. Thank you so much. And we've come to the conclusion of our conversation for the audience of the Tennessee Voices video podcast. Again, this is Jackie Sims, who is the Executive Director of the People's Alliance for Transit, Housing, and Employment. You can find more about their work at PATHE Nashville, that's PATHE Nashville.org. Before I let you go, Jackie, I always like to ask guests if they would leave some words of wisdom for the audience to help us get through this time.
I would say focus more on others and focus less on self. I would ask that people pay closer attention to building and sustaining relationships. I think the amount of time that we spend on social media has done some damage to that. So pay attention of the relationships that you're building and sustaining out in community.
Thank you so much, Jackie. May you stay well and healthy. And I'm so grateful for your time today on the show.
Thank you. Good to see you again, David.